Hi, I'm Dorothy. I'm 74 years old, and about 8 months ago, at my own niece's wedding, my sister introduced me to a table of strangers as the family housekeeper. Not a joke, not a slip of the tongue she caught and corrected. She said it, smiled, and moved on to the next table, like she'd just told them what kind of flowers were on the centerpieces. I was standing there in an apron someone handed me that morning, and for about 4 seconds, I honestly did not know what to do with my own face. That night ended with a young man I had hired 2 years earlier, standing up in front of 200 guests with a glass of champagne in his hand, correcting my own family about who I actually was. But I am getting ahead of myself because the wedding wasn't really where this story started. It started decades earlier, in a kitchen in Charlotte, North Carolina, where I was the one who fed everybody, fixed everybody, and never once got asked to sit down and rest. My sister's name is Barbara. I love her. I also spent 60 years being underestimated by her, and I think some part of me always knew it would come to a head eventually. Let me tell you who I actually am, because my family forgot somewhere along the way, and I let them forget, because I was raised to believe modesty was a virtue, and bragging was a sin. My husband Frank and I opened a little hardware counter in 1974 with money we didn't really have. 46 years later, that counter had become Ridgeline Industrial Supply, a company that ships parts to factories all over the Carolinas with 240 employees on the payroll. When Frank passed 6 years ago, I became chairwoman of the board. I still own 62% of that company. I still go into that office 2 mornings a week. Nobody in my family has ever asked me a single question about any of it. If Frank were still alive, I don't think any of this would have happened quite the way it did. He was the one who used to remind me every anniversary that the two of us had built something out of nothing, and that nothing about that deserved an apology to anybody. He grew up poor in a mill town outside Gastonia, and I grew up poor right here in Charlotte, in a house where my father's paycheck disappeared into a bar most Fridays before it ever reached our kitchen table. Frank and I understood each other in a way nobody else in either of our families ever quite managed to. We started that hardware counter with $3,000 from a wedding gift and a loan his uncle co-signed reluctantly, warning us both that we'd lose the shirts off our backs within a year. For the first 6 years, we lived above the store in a 2-room apartment with a hot plate and a window unit that only worked in 1 season out of 4. I did the books at night after closing, by hand, in a ledger I still have in a drawer somewhere, because we couldn't afford a bookkeeper, and I refused to trust anyone else with numbers that mattered that much to our survival as a family. By the time our first child was born, we had 4 employees and a real bank account instead of a coffee can hidden under the registered drawer. Our 3 children grew up watching both of us work, watching me sweep floors in a skirt and stockings because I refused to look anything less than presentable for customers, watching Frank load delivery trucks himself well into his 60s because he never asked an employee to do something he wouldn't do first. That is the family I actually come from. Whatever my sister has convinced herself and everyone else about who I am today. By the time I stepped back from day-to-day operations 6 years ago, Ridgeline supplied parts to manufacturing plants across 3 states, and the local Chamber of Commerce had twice asked me to speak at their annual dinner about small business survival. I said yes only once, and only because Frank would have wanted me to stand up there in his place. My family did not attend that dinner. They didn't know it happened at all, and I never mentioned it to them afterward, because by then, silence about my own accomplishments had become as natural to me as breathing, as automatic as locking the front door at night. Funny thing about being underestimated by people who love you, it doesn't feel like an insult. It feels like a slow, quiet erasure, one polite comment at a time. Have you ever sat in a room full of people who share your last name and felt like the only stranger in it? Have you ever been the one everybody calls when something needs fixing, but nobody calls when there's something to celebrate? I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight. Maybe you're driving home from a shift nobody thanked you for. Maybe you're lying in bed with the lights off, letting somebody else's voice keep you company. Wherever you are, I'm glad you're here, because I think this story might be for you as much as it was for me. Before I keep going, I want to ask you for something small. If channels like this one matter to you, if you like hearing stories about ordinary women who get pushed down and quietly rise back up, hit that subscribe button. It doesn't cost you a thing, and it's the only way this channel keeps going. One story at a time. Now, let me take you back to the beginning, back before the wedding, back to how a woman who built a company from a hardware counter ended up standing in a rented apron in her own family's eyes. My sister Barbara married well. That's the phrase our mother always used. Married well, like it was an achievement independent of Barbara herself. Her husband ran an insurance agency. They bought a big colonial house in Myers Park. And somewhere in the last 30 years, Barbara decided that the sister who never talks about money is the sister who doesn't have any. I let her believe it. Frank used to tell me I wore my success like an old coat I was embarrassed to be seen in. He wasn't wrong. I just never imagined how expensive that habit would get. When my niece Emily got engaged to a young man named David, the whole family lit up like Christmas morning. Emily is Barbara's only daughter, 26 years old, sharp as a tack, and genuinely sweet in a way that made it hard for me to stay upset with her. Even later, even when things got hard to swallow. The wedding planning started almost immediately, and within 2 weeks, without anyone actually asking me, I had become the designated helper. Not a bridesmaid, not a guest with opinions of her own, just the helper, quietly assigned the role the way you assign a chore to whichever child happens to be closest at the time. Barbara has a gift for making an insult sound like an invitation. She'd call me up and say, "Dorothy, you're just so good at this kind of thing. Would you mind handling the flowers, the cake tastings, the seating chart?" It's not that I minded helping. I raised 3 children practically alone, some years when Frank was traveling for the business. I know how to organize 100 moving parts without breaking a sweat. What I minded was the tone, the assumption that I existed to be useful, and that usefulness was the whole of my value to these people who shared my blood. By the 3rd month of planning, I was driving 40 minutes each way to taste cake samples. Barbara didn't have time for herself. I was calling florists and negotiating prices because, in Barbara's words, I was good at haggling, like haggling was some quaint talent poor people developed out of necessity. I spent an entire Saturday addressing 210 wedding invitations by hand because Emily wanted that vintage look and nobody else had the patience for it. Nobody asked if I had the patience either. They just assumed, because I'm the older one, because I'm the one who's always available, that my time belonged to whoever needed it most that particular week. There was a Tuesday in April I still think about more than I probably should. I had been up since 5 that morning at my own kitchen table, going over quarterly numbers for Ridgeline before the market opened, the way I have done nearly every day since Frank died. By 9, Barbara called to remind me I'd promised to pick up 200 mason jars from a craft store 40 minutes outside the city for the centerpieces because they were, quote, on n'importe quelle berge mais ici au bac. On sale that week only. I drove there in my good church shoes because I hadn't planned on manual labor that day, and I carried jar after jar to my car by myself in a parking lot, my knees aching by the 4th trip, while a teenage stock boy watched from the doorway and never once offered to help an old woman he assumed was just an old woman. I want to be honest with you about something. It wasn't the tasks themselves that wore me down. I have never been afraid of work. Not one day in my life. What wore me down was being asked instead of thanked, being assumed instead of appreciated, being handed a job the way you hand a job to someone whose time has no value of its own. Nobody in that family ever paused to ask if Tuesday worked for me, if I had a board call that afternoon. If maybe, just maybe, the woman who signs the checks for 240 other people's mortgages might have somewhere else important to be that day. One afternoon, Barbara's future mother-in-law, a woman named Patricia, was visiting to go over table linens, and Barbara introduced me by saying, "This is my sister Dorothy. She helps me with things like this. She's got nothing but time these days, nothing but time," as if the 62% of a company sitting quietly in my name amounted to nothing but time. I smiled and passed the sample napkins around because that is what I have always done. Smiled through the smallness other people assign me, folded it neatly, and carried on like it cost me nothing at all. At the bridal shower, 6 weeks before the wedding, I was the one who spent 3 hours the night before baking petit fours from scratch, a recipe my own mother taught me 60 years ago, because Barbara said store-bought would look cheap in the photographs. At the shower itself, when a cousin complimented the desserts, Barbara smiled and said, "Oh, isn't that sweet of Dorothy? She just loves being in the kitchen. It's basically her whole life these days." I stood near the punch bowl holding a serving spoon and said nothing, the way I had trained myself to say nothing for longer than I cared to admit out loud. By the 4th month, my role had quietly expanded again without anyone formally asking me first. I picked up the groom's tuxedo alterations from a shop across town because Barbara said she simply didn't have the bandwidth that week, whatever bandwidth meant to a woman who didn't work outside her own home most days. I stood in that alterations shop for 40 minutes while a young tailor pinned fabric on a mannequin, thinking about 4 department heads back at Ridgeline, waiting on my approval for a shipment schedule that touched 40 trucks across 2 states. Nobody at that shop knew who I was either, and for once that anonymity felt almost restful, a strange little pocket of peace inside an otherwise exhausting season. Once shopping for a dress to wear to the rehearsal dinner, since I was at least allowed to attend that part of the week as actual family, Barbara looked at what I'd chosen and said, "Oh, that's nice, though maybe something a little less noticeable, since you'll probably still be helping set up beforehand." I bought the dress anyway, a deep green one Frank would have loved on me. I wore it to the rehearsal dinner. Nobody at that dinner asked me a single question about my own life beyond whether I'd remembered to confirm the flower delivery time for the next morning, and I answered politely, because that is simply what I had trained myself to do by then. Barbara's husband, Tom, is not a cruel man. Not exactly, just an inattentive one. The kind of man who has spent 30 years assuming his wife's family arrangements are none of his business to question. One evening, helping load folding tables into his truck for the venue, he said to me almost kindly, "You know, Dorothy, it's good you've got something to keep you busy since Frank passed. Keeps the mind sharp at your age." I thanked him for his concern. I did not mention that the thing keeping my mind sharp that quarter was a supplier renegotiation worth $11 million, not folding tables in a stranger's driveway. I want you to understand something about who I was to that family before any of this. When our father drank away half of what our parents had, I was the one who finished raising Barbara, who was 12 years younger than me. I co-signed her first apartment lease when the landlord wouldn't take her word alone. I loaned her the down payment for her first house, money she paid back late and never once thanked me for out loud. When her first marriage fell apart, she and baby Emily lived in my spare bedroom for 8 months. I never once brought any of that up at the family dinner table. I didn't think love was supposed to keep score, and honestly, some part of me still doesn't. I think about the year Barbara's first husband left her when Emily was barely 2 years old, and how I drove to her apartment 3 nights a week after closing the store just to sit with her while she cried, just to hold that baby so Barbara could sleep for a few uninterrupted hours. I never once told this story to make her feel guilty later. I am telling you now only because I want you to understand the shape of what was actually owed in that family and how quietly, how completely it got forgotten the moment I stopped being useful in a way anyone could see clearly. But somewhere between raising her and watching her raise Emily, I became furniture in that family. Useful furniture, the kind you're grateful for in the moment and never think about otherwise. At family dinners, Barbara's husband would ask Frank about the business back when Frank was alive and never once turned to me, even though I ran half of it myself and knew the numbers better than Frank did some years. After Frank died, the questions about the company stopped altogether, like the business had died with him instead of simply changing hands to me, the woman standing right there refilling everyone's coffee. By month 4 of planning, I was no longer just handling errands. Barbara asked if I would consider, quote, helping out in the kitchen during the wedding itself, since I clearly enjoy that sort of thing. I remember standing in her kitchen when she asked it, drying a mixing bowl, and I remember thinking, when exactly did I say I enjoyed being unpaid labor at my own niece's wedding? But I didn't say that. I said, of course, honey, whatever you need. Because that is the script I had followed my whole life, and scripts are hard to walk away from, even when you can feel them cutting into your skin a little more each year. People ask me sometimes, later after they hear this story, why didn't you just tell them who you really were? Why did you let your own sister think you were broke and grateful for scraps of relevance in her life? It's a fair question, and I've turned it over more nights than I can count since the wedding. Part of it was Frank. He built that company believing quiet work speaks louder than a loud mouth, and some of that belief rubbed off on me over 40 years of marriage to him. Part of it was fear, plain and simple, fear that if I told them who I was, they would only love the company and never quite manage to love me. So I kept quiet, and I kept showing up, hauling folding chairs, taste-testing cake, ironing napkins that a rental company would have ironed for free if anyone had bothered to ask them. I told myself it was temporary, that once the wedding was over, things would go back to whatever normal we had before all this planning started. I didn't know yet that the wedding itself was going to be the place where 60 years of being quietly dismissed finally came due, all at once, in front of 200 people I had never met in my life. By the 5th month of wedding planning, my lower back had started aching in a way it hadn't since I was younger, hauling boxes of nails and light fixtures in the early years of the store. I never mentioned it to anyone in the family. I took over the counter aspirin quietly, the way I did most things quietly, and kept driving to florists and cake shops and rental companies because somewhere along the way, I had decided that my own discomfort was simply not information my family needed to have about me. 5 weeks before the wedding, Barbara called me with what she described as, quote, one more tiny favor. The venue, a place called Holloway Manor just outside the city, required outside catering staff to wear specific attire for insurance and uniformity reasons, or so she claimed. Barbara explained, very casually, that since I would already be in the kitchen helping, it made sense for me to just wear the staff uniform too, so I would, quote, blend in properly and not stick out among the real catering crew working that day. I sat with the phone against my ear for a long moment before I answered her. Blend in with the catering crew at my own niece's wedding, in front of everyone we both knew. I thought about hanging up right then. I thought about finally telling her exactly what my Tuesdays and Thursdays looked like, sitting in a boardroom signing off on contracts worth more than her entire house. Instead, I said, sure, Barbara, whatever's easiest for you. I have replayed that phone call more times than almost any other moment in my life, wondering what would have happened if I'd said something different that afternoon. That night, after the phone call about the uniform, I sat on my back porch with Frank's old cardigan around my shoulders, the one I still keep on a hook by the door 6 years after he died, and I asked myself out loud, to the empty yard, whether I was a fool for staying quiet this long. I did not have an answer that satisfied me. Part of me wanted to call Barbara back immediately and simply say the words, Barbara, I own 62% of a $60 million company. I am not your housekeeper. But some old, tired part of me, the part raised to believe good women don't announce their own worth, kept my hand off the phone that whole evening. I remember, almost as an afterthought, tossing my Ridgeline identification badge into my handbag the morning I left for that final dress fitting, out of pure habit, the same habit that has me carrying that badge nearly everywhere for 6 years running, long after most retired chairwomen would have stopped bothering. I didn't think anything of it at the time. I certainly didn't imagine a laminated rectangle of plastic would matter to anyone that season. It simply rode along in the bottom of my purse, underneath a folded tissue and a tube of lipstick, waiting for a day none of us could have predicted yet. When Barbara complained more than once about how expensive the wedding was getting, how she and Tom might have to dip into their own retirement savings to cover the final catering bill, I almost offered to help quietly, the way I have quietly helped before, more times than I could count across 3 decades. I stopped myself every single time. Some stubborn part of me wanted to see, just once, whether this family could get through something hard without treating me as the backup plan nobody ever thanked afterward, the quiet safety net nobody acknowledged existed until they needed it. Dignity to me was never really about being admired by anyone. It was about being accurately seen for who I actually am. I did not need my family to applaud my career or ask about quarterly earnings over Thanksgiving dinner. I only needed them to stop looking straight through me, the way you look through a window at the thing behind it, never once noticing the glass itself or wondering who keeps it clean. A week later, at a final planning dinner, Emily's future mother-in-law, Patricia, made a comment that stuck with me longer than almost anything Barbara herself ever said to me. She was talking about the seating chart, deciding where to put, quote, the help during the reception, and Barbara said, "Oh, don't worry about my sister. She won't be sitting anywhere. She'll be in the kitchen the whole time. She actually likes being useful. Gives her something to do at her age." I was 73 years old at the time, and I had closed a 7-figure supplier contract that same week at the office. Emily, to her credit, never once said anything unkind to me directly during that entire process, not once in 5 months of planning. If anything, she seemed a little embarrassed by her mother's requests, though not embarrassed enough to correct them out loud. Once, she pulled me aside near the caterer's tasting table and said, "Aunt Dorothy, you really don't have to do all this," and I just laughed it off and told her I didn't mind, because at that point, telling the truth to Emily felt like it would only complicate a day that was supposed to be about her happiness, not my dignity. That same week at Ridgeline, I sat across a conference table from a man named Grant Ashworth, our Vice President of Human Resources, going over a restructuring plan for the warehouse division. Grant has worked under me for 11 years. He treats me like his mentor because I am his mentor, whether either of us says that word out loud or not. He asked my opinion on every hire that touched senior management, including 18 months earlier, the promotion of a young operations manager named David Coleman to Director of Plant Operations. A promotion I personally approved after reviewing his file 3 times because I wanted to be certain. I remember sitting in that conference room thinking about the wedding uniform Barbara wanted me to wear and almost laughing out loud at the strangeness of my own life in that moment. In one building, grown men and women called me ma'am and waited for my signature before million-dollar decisions moved forward an inch. In my sister's kitchen, 40 minutes away, I was handed an apron and told to blend in with the help. I didn't laugh, though. I just nodded at Grant, approved the restructuring plan, and drove home afterward to iron more napkins for a wedding I wasn't even invited to as a guest. I remember in that same week standing in the Ridgeline parking lot after the meeting with Grant, watching the sun go down behind our main warehouse, a building I had personally financed the expansion of 11 years earlier against my own accountant's advice. 240 families depended in some real way on decisions I made in that building, and yet I was about to spend the coming weekend polishing borrowed silverware in a stranger's kitchen because my sister had decided that was where I belonged. The contrast sat in my chest like a stone I couldn't quite swallow or spit out. What I didn't know yet, what nobody in my family knew, was that the young man Emily was marrying, David Coleman, was the very same David Coleman who worked 2 floors below my office at Ridgeline Industrial Supply. Emily had mentioned her fiancé worked, quote, in industrial supply somewhere, but our family never asked follow-up questions about jobs that didn't sound glamorous enough to discuss at dinner, and I never made the connection out loud because, frankly, I didn't cross-reference my niece's wedding invitations with my own company's personnel files. Fate, it turns out, doesn't always announce itself in advance. Looking back now, I find it almost unbearable, in a strange way, that David Coleman had walked past my office door probably 100 times in 18 months, that I had reviewed his personnel file line by line, praised his numbers in a board meeting once by name, and that none of us, not me, not him, not anyone in either family, had ever connected the dots before that wedding day. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I had simply recognized his name sooner, if I could have spared myself and spared Barbara the whole public reckoning that was coming, but I don't know that I would change it, even now, given the choice. There was one moment, driving home from that final conference table meeting with Grant, when I almost turned my car around and drove straight to Barbara's house to tell her everything, plainly, over her own kitchen counter. Before the wedding could gather any more momentum toward whatever it was becoming, I got as far as her exit on the interstate before I kept driving past it, telling myself there would be a better moment later, a calmer one that wouldn't feel like an accusation. I am still not entirely sure that better moment would ever have arrived on its own, without the wedding forcing it into existence for both of us. I made a decision in that final week before the wedding, sitting alone at my kitchen table with a cup of decaf going cold in front of me. I decided I would not say a single word about who I was, not to defend myself, not to win an argument, not even to feel better in the moment. I decided I would simply go to that wedding, wear whatever they handed me, and watch, quietly, one more time, to see exactly how far my own family was willing to let this go. I did not know yet that I wouldn't have to say a word at all, that the truth would find its own way into that room, without any help from me. I want to be clear about something, because I don't want you to think I was plotting some kind of revenge that week. I wasn't. I genuinely did not know David worked for me, did not know Grant would be at that wedding, did not orchestrate a single part of what happened next. I only decided sitting at that kitchen table that I was done volunteering my own humiliation in advance. Whatever came next, I would simply stop helping it happen. That was the only decision I made, and it turned out to be enough. The morning of the wedding, I arrived at Holloway Manor at 7:30, 3 hours before most guests, dressed in the black polo and slacks Barbara had left folded on my porch 2 days earlier with a sticky note that said, "Thanks for this, you're a lifesaver." I stood in the parking lot for a full minute before I walked in, looking at that building, a converted plantation-style estate with white columns and a lawn that probably cost more to maintain each month than my entire mortgage payment used to be, back when Frank and I still had a mortgage at all. The kitchen at Holloway Manor smelled like butter and bleach and cut flowers all at once, a combination I will probably associate with that day for the rest of my life. Somebody had propped the back door open to let the June heat escape, and through it I could see the grounds crew mowing stripes into the lawn, where in a few hours 200 people would stand watching my niece promise herself to a man I had unknowingly already vouched for professionally, twice in writing. Inside, the catering staff, real professionals from a company called Southern Table Events, were already setting up chafing dishes and polishing glassware in the morning light. A young woman named Renata, maybe 25 years old, handed me an apron and a clipboard and said, "Are you the extra hand Mrs. Ellison mentioned?" I said yes. She said, "Great, we need someone plating appetizers and running trays during cocktail hour. Is that all right with you?" I said, of course, and tied the apron behind my back myself because nobody offered to help me with the knot, not even once that whole long day. By 10 that morning, my hands smelled like onion and lemon zest, and there was a thin line of sweat along my hairline that no amount of dabbing with a paper towel seemed to fix. I thought, standing over that prep station about my own office 3 miles away, the leather chair with my name on a small brass plate on the door, the view of the loading dock I still find satisfying after all these years. I did not resent the work itself. I have never once in my life resented work. I resented very specifically being placed in that kitchen by people who knew or should have known that I did not belong there out of necessity. Around 9 that morning, Barbara came through the kitchen in her robe, hair in curlers, barking instructions at 3 different vendors at once like a woman conducting an orchestra. She saw me at the prep station slicing melon and said, "Oh, good, you're already working. You always were the reliable one." Then she turned to Renata and said, "Don't worry about giving her a break. She's used to being on her feet all day. She'll be fine." I stood there with a paring knife in my hand, and I thought about the conference room at Ridgeline, where I had, the week before, told an entire executive team to take Fridays off during the holiday season. A few of David's co-workers passed through the kitchen briefly around 10:30, looking for ice, and one young man, maybe 30 years old, looked at me apologetically and said, "Sorry to bother you back here, ma'am. We just need a hand with the cooler." I helped him find it without a word about who I actually was to that ice machine's parent company. He thanked me twice and left. I remember thinking at the time that it was strangely peaceful being unknown for those few minutes before I remembered why being unknown in that particular kitchen had cost me something all spring. Around 10:45, Barbara swept back through the kitchen one more time, this time trailing a photographer taking candid shots of the preparations for the wedding album. She positioned herself near the cake table and, without looking at me directly, said to the photographer, "Oh, don't worry about getting her in any shots. She's just helping in the back today. Just helping in the back." 26 years of birthdays, graduations, and hospital waiting rooms, reduced to 4 words in front of a stranger holding a camera. The wedding coordinator, a brisk young woman named Chelsea, walked past me 4 separate times that morning, issuing instructions to the real catering staff. And each time she looked at me last, if at all, the way you glance at a chair to make sure it's still in its place before moving on to something that actually requires your attention. I didn't blame Chelsea. She had no way of knowing who I was, and frankly, that was exactly the arrangement my own sister had built around me, brick by brick, euphemism by euphemism, for months. By 11, guests started arriving, and through the kitchen's swinging door, I caught glimpses of the ballroom filling up with people in tailored suits and silk dresses, women adjusting diamond earrings in little compact mirrors, men in cufflinks shaking hands like it was a business conference instead of a wedding celebration. I recognized a few faces from David's side, people I assumed were his co-workers, though I didn't think much of it at the time. I was too busy arranging shrimp cocktail on silver trays to think about anything except getting through the day with my dignity somewhat intact. I want to pause here for just a second because I know some of you listening have stood in a kitchen like that one, working while other people celebrated, feeling invisible in a room full of your own blood relatives. If that's you, I see you, and I'm grateful you're still here listening to me tonight. If this story is doing anything for you at all, consider subscribing to this channel. It costs nothing, and it's the reason stories like mine get told at all instead of staying quiet in some kitchen forever, unheard. Now, let me tell you what happened during cocktail hour, because that's where things started to turn for good. By the time Renata came looking for someone to help with the veranda trays, I had been on my feet for nearly 5 hours without a single real break, and some small, tired part of me almost hoped somebody else would be asked instead. But nobody else was standing closest to the door when she looked up. I remember the exact warmth of that tray against my palms a few minutes later, heat coming through the thin cloth I'd wrapped around the edges, and the small, almost foolish thought that crossed my mind as I pushed through the swinging door toward the veranda. I thought, at least the mushrooms look nice today. That is what dignity gets reduced to sometimes. Taking a small private pride in a garnish, because it is the one thing left in the moment that you still fully control. Around noon, Renata asked me to carry a tray of stuffed mushrooms out into the cocktail hour space on the veranda since one of the regular servers had twisted her ankle on the lawn earlier. I hesitated because stepping out from the kitchen meant stepping into a room full of my niece's guests while wearing a caterer's uniform. But Renata looked frazzled, and old habits die hard in a woman like me, so I picked up the tray and walked out into the sunlight without another word. I moved through clusters of well-dressed strangers offering mushrooms, saying excuse me, saying thank you, invisible in exactly the way catering staff are trained to be invisible at events like this. And then I heard Barbara's voice, bright and social, coming from a table near the edge of the veranda, the kind of voice she used when she wanted to impress people. And I heard my own name land inside a sentence that would not leave me alone for a long time afterward. Barbara was standing with a small group, including a distinguished-looking older man I didn't recognize, and as I approached with my tray, she reached out, touched my arm lightly, and said, "Everyone, this is Dorothy. She's the family housekeeper. She practically runs my household. We couldn't survive these big events without her." The older man smiled politely at me. Someone else murmured something about how lovely that must be for Barbara, and I stood there, holding a silver tray of stuffed mushrooms in front of strangers, being introduced as staff at my own niece's wedding in broad daylight. I want to tell you exactly what went through my mind in that moment, because I think it matters more than anything else in this story. I did not feel rage, not right away. I felt a kind of quiet, cold clarity, the same clarity I used to feel in difficult board meetings when a hard decision had to be made, and there wasn't time left for emotion. I set the tray down gently on the nearest table. I straightened my shoulders. I said in a voice that surprised even me with how calm it came out, "Lovely to meet you all," and I turned and walked back toward the kitchen without looking back once. On that walk back across the lawn, I made a promise to myself, the kind of promise you make once in a lifetime and never break afterward. I promised myself that whatever happened for the rest of that day, I would finish it with my dignity intact, and that this would be the very last event where I let my family hand me an apron instead of a seat at the table. I did not know, walking across that grass, that I would not have to enforce that promise myself. Someone else was about to do it for me in front of every single person at that wedding without me asking a soul. What I hadn't seen, because my back was turned toward the veranda table, was that the distinguished older man standing with Barbara's group was Grant Ashworth, our Vice President of Human Resources at Ridgeline, invited as a guest of David's side, since he had worked closely with David for the past 2 years on several projects. Grant had heard every single word Barbara said. And Grant, unlike everyone else standing at that party, knew exactly who I actually was, down to the last detail of my title. I learned all of this afterward, pieced together from David himself and from Grant separately. Apparently, Grant stood there for a moment, stunned, watching me walk away with my tray, and then he excused himself from the group and went looking for David, who was near the bar greeting his own co-workers from the office. Grant pulled him aside and said, quote, "Do you know who that woman was that Barbara just introduced as the housekeeper?" David said, "That's Emily's Aunt Dorothy, why do you ask?" And Grant said, "David, that is Dorothy Whitfield. That is our chairwoman of the board. That is the woman who personally approved your promotion 18 months ago." David told me later that his stomach dropped straight through the floor when Grant said my full name out loud. He said he stood there running through every conversation he had ever had with Emily about her Aunt Dorothy, the sweet older widow who helped out with everything, who never talked much about herself at family gatherings, who Emily described once as, quote, "kind of a homebody who used to work in an office somewhere before she retired years ago." David had shaken my hand exactly twice before that wedding, both times briefly, both times without any idea at all that I had signed off on his entire career. An hour later, during the reception dinner, the best man finished his toast, and there was a pause while the room settled for the next one to speak. David stood up, and I remember thinking, from my spot near the kitchen doorway where I had slipped out to watch the toasts unfold, that he looked pale, nervous, in a way that didn't match a groom simply about to say something sweet about his new wife on their wedding day. David lifted his glass, and instead of launching into the usual toast about love and partnership, he said, "Before I say anything about Emily, who I love more than anything in this world, I need to correct something I heard earlier today because I can't sit here and let it go unsaid. Somebody introduced Emily's Aunt Dorothy today as the family housekeeper. I need everyone in this room to know that is not who this woman is. Dorothy Whitfield is the chairwoman of the board at Ridgeline Industrial Supply, the company I work for every single day. She built that company from a single hardware counter with her late husband decades ago. She personally approved my promotion. Half of the people I work with owe their jobs in some way to decisions she made over the years. She is not the help. She is one of the most respected people in this entire region, and she has spent all day today serving food to people who didn't know enough to be embarrassed by that." I watched Emily's face throughout David's toast, and I will remember the look on it until the day I die. It moved from confusion to recognition to something that looked almost like grief. The specific grief of realizing you never really knew a person you thought you understood completely. She turned to look at me across that lawn, her eyes already filling, her hand pressed flat against her chest, the way our mother used to press her hand against her own chest during moments too big for words. I felt, in that same instant, something loosen in my own chest that had been tight for months, maybe longer than months if I am honest with myself. It was not triumph exactly, and it was certainly not vindication in the way people sometimes assume when they hear this part of my story. It was closer to relief, the specific relief of finally being witnessed accurately after a very long stretch of being politely, casually erased by people who never meant any particular harm by it, and somehow that made it harder to sit with, not easier. You could have heard a pin drop on that lawn after David finished speaking. I stood frozen in the kitchen doorway, apron still tied around my waist, watching 200 faces turn slowly toward me all at once. Barbara's face went the color of the tablecloth in front of her. Patricia set down her wine glass without drinking from it. Somewhere near the back, I saw Grant Ashworth nodding slightly, like a man who had just watched a long overdue debt finally get paid in full. A woman I didn't know, sitting at a table near the dance floor, actually stood halfway up out of her chair, hand over her mouth. Somewhere behind me I heard a man mutter, "Wait," the Ridgeline lady to his date, like he was placing a name he'd read in a regional business journal a year earlier. Barbara's own mother-in-law, reached for her wine glass, and then seemed to think better of it entirely, setting it back down without a sip. I want to pause again, right here at the turn of this whole story, because I think this is the moment worth sitting with longest. It is not about the money, and it was never really about the title on my business card. It was about a room full of people I loved finally seeing me as a whole person instead of a convenient pair of hands. If any part of this is landing with you tonight, I'd be grateful if you subscribe to this channel. It helps more than you know, and it costs you nothing at all to do. Now let me tell you what I did next, because it surprised even me in the moment. I untied the apron slowly, folded it over my arm, and walked out onto the lawn toward the head table in full view of everyone gathered there. I did not run to David and hug him theatrically for the crowd. I did not point at Barbara or demand an apology from anyone. I simply walked the way I had walked into every board meeting for the last 40 years of my life, with my shoulders back and my chin level, and I said quietly enough that only the closest tables could hear me, "Thank you, David, but there's no need to make a speech out of it. I'm just glad to be here for Emily's day." Barbara found me 20 minutes later in the small room off the kitchen, where I had gone to splash water on my face and collect myself. She stood in the doorway for a long moment before she said anything at all. When she finally spoke, her voice cracked in a way I hadn't heard since our father's funeral decades earlier. She said, "Why didn't you tell me?" I looked at her in the mirror and said, "Would it have mattered, Barbara? Would you have asked me to wear an apron if you'd known who I really was?" She didn't answer right away, and that silence told me more than any answer ever could have. Barbara and I talked for a long time that night, longer than we had talked, just the two of us, in years. She cried, actually cried, sitting on the edge of that little cot in the storage room, and she told me she thought she had been doing me a favor all those years, giving me something to do, somewhere to belong, since I never remarried after Frank and never seemed to have much of a social life of my own. I told her that a woman doesn't need to be pitied into usefulness. She needs to be asked plainly what she wants, the same as anybody else in the family gets asked. For the rest of the reception, something had shifted in the room, a kind of quiet recalibration you could feel even from across the lawn. Patricia found me near the dessert table and apologized twice awkwardly, clearly more concerned about her own son's business relationships than about me personally, but I accepted the apology anyway, because holding on to every slight would have cost me more in the end than it cost anyone else involved. Guests I had served appetizers to an hour earlier now approached me to introduce themselves properly, some of them, I noticed, suddenly very interested in what Ridgeline Industrial Supply might be hiring for these days. Emily found me last after most of the guests had moved to the dance floor for the first dances. She hugged me hard, the way she used to hug me as a little girl staying over at my house on weekends. She said, "Aunt Dorothy, I am so sorry. I had no idea. Mom never told any of us what you actually did for a living. I thought you just—" and she stopped herself before finishing that sentence out loud. I told her the truth, that I never wanted her wedding turned into a spectacle about me, and that the only thing I wanted from that day forward was to be invited places as her aunt, not as her staff. In the months since that wedding, things have changed in ways I did not expect at all. Barbara calls now, actually calls to talk, not to assign tasks the way she used to. She invited me to Thanksgiving this year and asked for the first time in maybe 15 years what I wanted to bring, instead of simply telling me what to cook and when to arrive. It is a small thing being asked instead of told, but I promise you, if you have lived my life, you understand exactly how large a small thing like that can be to a person who never got asked anything. David, for his part, has become something like family to me in a way I never expected from a nephew-in-law. He stops by my office sometimes just to talk, not about the wedding, not to apologize again and again, just to talk about the warehouse expansion or a supplier problem, the way any junior director might talk to a chairwoman he genuinely respects. Emily told me recently that David still gets quiet sometimes thinking about that toast, worried he embarrassed the family in front of everyone, and I told her to tell him he did the exact opposite. He told the truth out loud. Nobody should ever apologize for that. Grant told me weeks later over coffee in my office that the story of that wedding toast had made its way around Ridgeline within about 2 days, told and retold in the break room and the loading dock alike. He said it did something for morale he couldn't have engineered with any policy memo, seeing the chairwoman treated with disrespect by her own family, and seeing a junior director stand up for her in public without being asked to. I told him I hadn't done any of it for morale. I told him some things simply need saying out loud, wherever you happen to be standing when the moment arrives. My own children, grown now with families of their own in other states, heard about that wedding within days, the way news like that travels through a family group chat, faster than any of us would like to admit these days. My son called me that same week and said, "Mom, why didn't you ever tell us how bad it had gotten with Aunt Barbara?" I told him the truth, that I hadn't fully admitted it to myself either, not until I was standing on that lawn holding a tray of stuffed mushrooms in an apron that was never actually mine to begin with. Before I get to how I really feel about all of this now, months later, I want to ask one more time, gently, if you've made it this far in my story, would you consider subscribing to this channel? These stories take real time and real care to put together properly, and every subscriber tells me it's worth continuing to do. It costs you nothing, and it means everything to a small channel like this one. Now let me tell you what I've learned from all of it, because I think it's the part that matters most tonight. I did not go back to catering the next family event, and I never will again as long as I live. I set a limit that day, not with anger, but with clarity. The same clarity I learned running a company for 40 years of my life. I will show up for my family. I will love them, help them when they truly need it, sit at their tables and hold their babies, and drive 4 hours for a graduation if that's what's genuinely asked of me. But I will not serve people who cannot see me as a whole person. Respect is not optional in exchange for my presence anymore. It is simply the price of admission now. Christmas that year looked different too. For the first time since Frank died, nobody handed me an apron the moment I walked through the door. Barbara's husband Tom actually asked me, unprompted, what I thought about the economy heading into the new year, a question he had never once directed at me in 30 years of marriage to my sister. It is a small thing being asked a real question by a man who used to talk past me at every family dinner, but I promise you, small things add up into an entirely different life if you let them. There was a test of that new limit just 2 months later at a cousin's baby shower when someone, out of old habit, asked if I would mind picking up the balloons on my way over since I was, quote, driving right past that shopping center anyway. I said, I'm happy to grab them if someone can send me the address and a little cash for gas, otherwise I'll see everyone there at 2. Nobody argued. The balloons got picked up by someone else entirely, and I arrived at that shower exactly on time as a guest, with nothing in my hands but a gift. I still drive the same modest sedan I've had for 9 years, still live in the same 3-bedroom house Frank and I bought in 1989, long before Ridgeline ever made either of us anything close to wealthy on paper. Money was never really the point of this story, not for me, personally, but I won't pretend it didn't sting a little, watching guests in that ballroom wearing jewelry worth more than my first house, while assuming the woman quietly refilling the ice was just tired old help who needed a rest before the night was through. Grant asked me once, months after the wedding, whether I ever thought about stepping all the way back from Ridgeline now that everyone finally knew who I was, whether the whole ordeal had made me want to disappear into a quieter retirement instead. I told him no, the opposite really. I go into that office 2 mornings a week not because the company needs me every hour, it doesn't anymore, but because that building is the one place I never had to explain my own worth to a single soul, the one room in my whole life where I was simply, plainly, already understood. I think about all the women my age I know, women who spent their whole lives being the reliable one, the free labor, the built-in babysitter and caterer, and seamstress all rolled into one exhausted person, and I wonder how many of them are still waiting for someone else to hand them permission to say enough. Nobody ever handed me that permission either. I had to take it myself, in an apron, on a lawn, in front of 200 strangers at 73 years old, and some part of me wishes I had taken it decades sooner. If you take one thing away from my story tonight, let it be this. However old you are, however long you have spent being the reliable one, the useful one, the one nobody thinks to think out loud, you are allowed to want more than usefulness from the people who claim to love you the most. You're allowed to want a seat at the table, not just a job in somebody else's kitchen. I don't know everyone's situation listening tonight, whether it's a sister like mine or a grown child or a coworker who has quietly decided your time costs nothing because you never told them otherwise. But I do know this: nobody is coming to announce your worth for you at a podium with a glass of champagne in their hand. Sometimes that happens the way it happened for me, almost by accident. But you cannot build a life around waiting for someone else's toast to save you. Some of you have already lived through your own version of that lawn, your own version of an apron you never agreed to wear, and I suspect a few of you are still standing in it right now, waiting for the right moment to set the tray down. You do not need a toast, or a witness, or a stranger's recognition to give yourself permission. You are allowed to decide quietly, on an ordinary afternoon with nobody watching at all, that the serving is over. It took me 73 years and a stranger's toast at a wedding to learn that lesson, and I would rather you learn it sooner than I did. You do not have to make a scene to demand basic respect from anyone. Sometimes the truth simply needs a witness and it will stand up on its own 2 feet, the way David stood up that day with a glass of champagne in his hand. I think about that day often, not with bitterness, but with something closer to gratitude these days. It took losing an apron in front of 200 strangers for my own family to finally see the whole of who I am. I would not wish that path on anyone listening tonight, but I'm grateful, in the end, that the truth found its own way into daylight. Thank you for sitting with me through this story tonight, whoever you are, wherever you're listening from right now. If it meant something to you, please consider subscribing and sharing it with someone who needs to hear it, someone who has spent too long being underestimated by the people who should know better by now. I'll be back soon with another story. Until then, take care of yourselves and remember, you are never just the help in your own life.